Back years ago, King George had ordered that nobody was ever supposed to come across these mountains and live on this side of the mountain. All this land belonged to the Cherokees. But the fact is, he had taxed people so heavily, the poor people couldn't afford to pay their taxes, so little by little they started coming across these mountains, making treaties with the Cherokee, fighting with the Cherokee, and eventually they wound up with 3 settlements over here. The Watauga settlement, the Holston settlement up on the Holston River, and the Nolichucky settlement down on the Nolichucky. And for many years, these people lived here in peace. It was the first time in their life most of them were free, out from under the king's rule. But a few years later, the Revolutionary War broke out. And Washington had been fighting up north for quite some time. But it didn't seem to have much effect on these people over in the Overmoutain settlements they became known as. They seemed miles away from this war. But after Washington had been fighting for 5 long years, the British couldn't seem to gain any ground. The British came up with a plan. They called it the Southern Strategy. They sent a British officer down the East Coast, and he laid siege to Charleston. Came on up and laid siege to Charlottetown. This man, commander's name was Cornwallis. He had 2 commanders under him, Bannister Tarleton, which led the British Dragoons, the British Cavalry, and a man by the name of Patrick Ferguson. Now, Ferguson's job was to raise an army of loyalists, Americans just like the Overmountain people, but the ones that were still loyal to King George. They were going to raise this army of loyalists, march them across the Carolinas, catch George Washington between these 2 armies, and put an end to this war forever. And I have to tell you, their plan was working just fine. They were raising quite the army. But they were a few die-hard patriots left in the Carolinas. And the word started spreading, and little by little they started resisting the British. But as Ferguson was fighting with these little handful of patriots from time to time, he had learned about the settlements on this side of the mountain. And he sent a threat to these people. He sent a prisoner across the mountain. And this is what he told these people. He said, you lay down your arms. You pledge loyalty to King George, or I will march my army over the mountain. I will hang your leaders, and I will lay waste your homes and crops with fire and sword. He made a big mistake. Because as soon as that threat came over these mountains, every man that come across these mountains had joined the militia. If he was old enough to fight, you had to be in the militia. As soon as that message came to Isaac Shelby on the Holston River, he contacted John Sevier, and they started calling up the militia. Sevier raised 240 men from the Nolichucky and the Watauga. Isaac Shelby raised 240 men, and they met at Fort Watauga at Sycamore Shoals. They'd been here just a short time. They had convinced William Campbell to send some men to help, so they were 200 Virginians came across the shoals. Right down here where we crossed, as a matter of fact. Just a short time later, Arthur Campbell brought 200 more men in from Virginia, and they'd made a decision. This Ferguson, the bulldog they called him, he wanted to fight. Well, they'll give him a fight, but they're not fighting him here. Not in their cornfields and around their homes. No, they'll take it to him. Had a lady by the name of Miss Mary Patton. She'd brought them 500 pounds of some of the finest gunpowder you could get a hold of. And they set out. They left Fort Watauga, and it began to rain. They got up next to Rome Mountain and stored all that powder under a big rock overhang called the Shelvin Rock. It's still there today. Next morning they got up and headed straight up the top of the mountain, a place called the Yellow Mountain Gap. By the time they got to the top of that mountain, it wasn't raining anymore. The snow was shoe mouth deep. It was ankle deep. They made camp there that night. Got up the next morning, 2 of John Spear's men were missing. 2 guys by the name of Chambers and Crawford. They figured these men had deserted to tell Ferguson this army was on its way, and sure enough, that's what they done. Then they had a problem because on the other side of the mountain there were 2 trails that went off. So they split their forces. The Virginians took one trail. Campbell, his men went down that trail. Shelby and Sevier took their men and took the other one. They came off that mountain because they knew if they all took one trail, Ferguson may be marching his army up the other and ride right into the settlement. Now, they came together in a place called Quaker Meadows. A place owned by Charles McDowell. Charles, he was a patriot too. He'd been scrapping with the British from time to time. Now, as they sat there at the McDowells in the rain, a bunch of men come riding in from Surrey County, North Carolina, being led by Benjamin Cleveland and Major Winston. Their army was growing. And as they sat there that night, the scouts came in. They had located Ferguson. He was camped at a place called Gilberttown. They rode in the pouring rain, made camp for a couple of days because it just absolutely poured on these men. A few days later, they were right outside of Gilberttown. They took the rifles, come screaming out in that field where Ferguson was at, and he was gone. He'd been gone for 2 days. And even their best scouts couldn't find his trail because it had rained so much. There was a man traveling with him. Williams was his name. He said, oh, he's headed to that big British fort down South Carolina, Fort 96. So that's the direction they started riding. The next night, they were camped down on the Green River, a place called Alexander's Ford. A man come riding through the camp. They almost shot him, drug him out of the saddle. Kept telling him, my name's Everett Lacey, take me to see Colonel Sevier. They took him to Colonel Sevier, and sure enough, he was a little commander of militia down in South Carolina. He asked Colonel Sevier, so where are you boys going? He said, we're headed to Fort 96, we're going to whip Patrick Ferguson. He said, well, I don't know where you got your information, but you're going the wrong way. Because Ferguson, he's not headed to 96, he's headed to Charlottetown to get reinforcements. Now every man there knew that if Ferguson got reinforced, not a single one of them would be coming home. They'd all rode to their deaths. So Lacey agreed to meet him the next day, all of them, at a place called the Cowpens. The next morning, they got up and they rode 29 miles that day. Come riding into the Cowpens. The Cowpens was owned by a wealthy loyalist. He'd buy up all the cattle in that area and graze them, then pay men to drive them to the market. Those men rode in there and they hadn't had a bite to eat since they left Charles McDowell's place. So I'm pretty sure from what I understand about reading about most of these men, none of them were thieves. But every one of them was armed and every one of them was hungry. So they helped themselves to that man's beef. First good meal they'd had in a long time. Then they tried to rest on that wet ground. But none of them could rest because they knew this was their only chance. They would never have an army like this together again. So at 9 o'clock at night, the commanders had made a decision. They come walking through their camps and they started picking out 900 of their best men. And they picked out 900 of the best horses that they hadn't rode into the ground chasing Ferguson. And at 9 o'clock at night, they rode off in the dark in the pouring rain, looking for Ferguson. All night long they rode through that rain, through the darkness. They forded the Broad River and it was above the flood level. In the middle of the night, those men crossed that river. Nothing was going to stop them. All night long they rode. Next morning they rode up on a little homestead, a little house. They had a young man traveling with them. Enoch was his name, Enoch Gilmer. Enoch, he went up to the commanders. He said, I got an idea. If you let me go over to that house, I'll find out where Ferguson's at. So they all hid in the woods. Little Enoch went over to the house, walked up on the porch and knocked on the door, and there were 2 women living there. Little Enoch looked tough. He said, I'm looking for Patrick Ferguson. I want to join his army. The lady said, well, I know exactly where he's at. I took him eggs for breakfast this morning. He's camped out on Kings Mountain. And they give Enoch about enough time. They figured he found out what they needed. They come busting in that house, grabbed Enoch, and they's going to hang him as a traitor. And then women started squalling, well, don't hang him, he's just a boy. One of the men spoke up and said, well, not to offend these ladies, we take him down the road and hang him. So they drug him out of the house where the women couldn't see him. Commanders called him up and said, Enoch, did you find Ferguson? He said, oh yeah. He's camped out on Kings Mountain. Now they knew exactly where he was at. And they were riding harder than they had ever ridden because this threat was going to end, and it was going to end today. Well, about lunchtime, a lot of those men, they wanted to stop and rest. Now Isaac Shelby come riding right through the men. He said, rest. I will not rest until I ride into the lines of Cornwallis himself. He fired them up and they kept riding. Now right before 3 o'clock, finally, the rain stopped. They were all at the bottom of Kings Mountain. William Campbell and those boys from Virginia, they took the front of that mountain. Isaac Shelby and the boys from the Holston settlement, they went around that side. Old Ben Cleveland and other commanders took the back. John Sevier and all the boys from the Watauga and Nolichucky, they took the other side and they had him. He wasn't going anywhere. They hit that mountain the first time, they drove them back. They hit that mountain the second time, they drove them back. But the third time they hit that little mountain, they went almost to the top. Because a lot of those men, they had been fighting the Cherokee for years. They knew when the Cherokee come out of the woods to attack the settlement, while they were screaming, it'd make your hair stand up, it'd make your skin crawl. So as they hit that mountain, the third time they were screaming just like the Cherokee. As a matter of fact, Captain DePeister turned and looked at Ferguson on top of that mountain that day, and he said, this is ominous. It's them damn yelling boys, because he'd already experienced them frontiersmen at Musgrove Mills. They went almost to the top of that mountain the third time, because not only were they screaming like the Cherokee, they were fighting like the Cherokee. They was hiding behind the trees and rocks, giving them Indian play. They'd step out and fire and step back in and reload. And when they got almost to the top, there was Ferguson. He was on a big white horse, had on a plaid shirt, 2 silver whistles, had his saber in one hand. He was riding back and forth across that little old mountain, blowing those whistles and barking out commands to his men. A lot of his men seen they were being overrun. They'd raise up a flag. Ferguson come riding by and cut it down. Now, nobody knows to this day if Ferguson was trying to escape. Nobody knows if he was trying to rally his men. But what we do know is he got too far on the south side of the mountain that day. He ran smack into John Sevier and them boys in the Watauga, Nolichucky. They were swarming like yellow jackets. There was a young man was the first one to spot him. John Gilliland was his name. He raised his rifle and took a careful aim. And when he pulled that trigger, it went click. His gun misfired. There was an older gentleman right beside him that day. Robert Young was his name. Robert was 62 years old. Now, for you folks that don't know, Robert named his rifle after his wife Mary. But he didn't call his rifle Mary. He called it Sweet Lips because that's what he called Mary. Old Robert raised that rifle up and he took a careful aim. He said, we'll see what Sweet Lips can do. When he pulled that trigger, Ferguson came right out of the saddle. But his foot hung in a stirrup in his horse boot. And you know, by the time the boys got his horse stopped, he had 8 more holes in him. Ferguson told his men when he got to Kings Mountain, he said, God Almighty and all his angels won't take me off this mountain. Well, he was right, because they buried him there. Every man that was fighting with Ferguson that day was killed or captured. And they were 28 patriots that never seen the sun set. It took about a week for Cornwallis to find out that them boys had whipped Ferguson so bad. But as soon as he found out, well, he turned tail around like a scalded dog. He started retreating. He had no idea where this Overmoutain army was at. This band of rabble, he called them. The Overmoutain men, they sent some boys marching the prisoners north up the Yadkin River. The rest of them turned. They came right back across these mountains. They came back over here to raise their crops and to raise their kids. But the most important seed those men ever planted was that day on Kings Mountain. Because within an hour and 5 minutes, they planted the seed of freedom. Because what they done that day was nothing short of a miracle. If you think about it, there was a band of 900 starved, exhausted. Hunters and farmers volunteered to the very last man. They stopped and forced a retreat of the most powerful army in the whole world. Then they came home. Now years ago, there was a group just like us, dressed like us, maybe not as pretty as all of us. 1975, I believe it was, they actually started here at Sycamore Shoals. And they started following the trail that those Overmoutain men took to Kings Mountain. And they walked every step from here to Kings Mountain. A few years later, they backed all the way up to Abington, Virginia, where William Campbell and his men mustered. And they walked every step of the way to Kings Mountain. Well, this went on for years and years. In 1980, Senator James Broyhill took it to Congress. President Jimmy Carter signed it into law, and it became a national historic trail, just like the Lewis and Clark Trail, the Santa Fe Trail. Well, several years ago, there was a group of us, maybe because we got old and fat, we decided to quit walking so much and start talking more. We started telling this story. 11 years ago was my first time on this march. And that year we told the story. I didn't. Some of the older people that was there did. They told this story to 5,400 people in 2 weeks. Last year, we extended it by about a week, and we told this story to over 14,000 people in 3 weeks. And over 8,000 of them were 4th and 5th graders. We call it keeping the story alive. It's the story of the American spirit. It tells us who we are as a people, what we can do when we stand together under a common thread. And I would like to invite each and every one of you to join us, join our organization, join us on the march, help us cross the river, just come and hang out. But you're welcome to talk to any of us after this program. We'll help you if you want to become a member. Or you can find us online at ovta.org or the Overmoutain Victory Trail Facebook page. You can actually keep up with us as we're going down the trail this year. But feel free to join us anytime, any place down the trail from here to Kings Mountain. Because on October the 7th at 3 o'clock when the battle started, we'll be walking into Kings Mountain. Thank you.